And truly, I've experienced wonderful, but also harmful providers throughout the
Yeah.
infertility journey,
Mm-hmm.
my pregnancy, during the birth, postpartum.
Yeah.
I've come across providers who have done so much harm, and
Mm-hmm.
it's not okay, first of all. But I
No.
want to empower other women that it's okay to say no. It's okay
Yeah.
to fire a provider for any reason. It's okay to, it's not just okay, but it's essential to have a team of people that you feel safe and comfortable with, because infertility and pregnancy, I think, especially, are the most vulnerable times that a person might ever go through in their life.
Mm-hmm. Welcome to Sensitive Stories. This episode is for educational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for treatment with a mental health or medical professional. Let's dive in. Welcome, Liz. I'm so happy to have you here on the podcast today.
I am so excited to be here, knowing you as a friend, as a colleague, and
Yes, I know we
all of
go
the
way
above.
back and we've done other projects together, and it's sweet to be coming together again in this space and hearing more of your personal story. So before we get started, though, I always like to ask people what your HSP discovery story is, how and when you realize that you're a highly sensitive person.
I wish I had a really exciting story to share with you, or even knew the exact moment that I found out that I was HSP, but I don't remember exactly. It was probably 7 or 8 years ago, and my guess is that I just stumbled across something, and it might have been your Facebook group that you have for highly sensitive therapists. It might have been an article or a blog or a podcast. Again, I don't remember the exact context, but what I do remember is learning that there was a name for what I had experienced my whole life. And so that aha moment of discovery and feeling like, wow, this is actually, I want this to be a piece of my identity because it fits. And that I kind of just took off. And since then, that is, that's where I found my best friends and connected with you. So,
Mm-hmm. Oh, I love that. I want this to be a piece of my identity. That is so empowering. It feels so good
yeah,
to hear it. And there is something about that, right? Having the context. Oh, this is why I am the way I am. And oftentimes the actual moment kind of fades in the distance, but just that feeling of, okay, I know myself is really, really
exactly.
powerful. And yeah, it's so much community comes out. I just can't believe how many people I've connected with since realizing that I'm an HSP, you being one of them.
Yeah.
It's incredible from all over the place.
Yeah. And I think for HSPs, we need deep connection.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
looking back, realizing that most of the people in my life pre HSP discovery are not sensitive. And I felt like really didn't understand me.
Yeah, it's true. You start to realize, oh, I need more people like myself in my life, and I think there's more space to be fully sensitive and just let those parts of you out and not be the caregiver all the time or the one who puts themselves aside or the empathetic one, however you want to hold it. So yeah, a lot of things shift after that aha moment.
Yes, personally and professionally, because
Absolutely.
I started working with primarily highly sensitive women in their, mid 20s, 30s as
Hmm.
a therapist. And so that
Yeah.
has been really amazing too, to, even though my clients don't know a ton about my my history, personal history, or even the ways in which I'm highly sensitive, but a
Hmm.
lot of them say, Liz, just knowing that you're an HSP, that's enough.
That's
That feels
enough.
really good.
Doesn't it? It's like just being able to be with, there's something different about being with an HSP
Yeah,
in friendship, community, and relationship of any kind. It's like, ah, I can just relax. I can be myself and I get it.
exactly. And
That
it
goes a
shows
long
it
way.
different. Yeah, it shows it differently for all of us, but it's like this common language.
Exactly. You can settle into.
Mhm.
Well, speaking of your work, I know you have since kind of switched your work based on your personal experience with infertility, with IVF. So I'm curious, how has being an HSP impacted that experience as much as you can tell?
I would say it's impacted that in every single way. We probably don't even have enough time for me to go into all of it. But when I was preparing to talk with you today, I was really reflecting on my experience as an HSP. So I actually went through the HSP test on Dr. Elaine's website again, just to reacclimate myself with some of the traits and where I fit in. And then, thinking about my infertility journey and then the intersection between the two. And, one of the things, so I guess I can kind of talk about in terms of like physical, mental, and emotional impacts that it had. So I'll just go into each of those a little bit. In terms of the physical impact that IVF had on me is, first of all, I just want to name that anyone going through infertility is, well, first of all, a warrior, but it's going to look different for every person. But there are definitely some commonalities. So I would say the physical impact is essentially, just for a little bit of background context, for a menstruating woman, generally her ovaries are the size of thumbs. So one egg is released each month during ovulation and the cycle repeats. During IVF, one of the phases is ovarian stimulation. You might hear people say like, I'm doing stims. That's kind of the abbreviation that, it's easier to say that. And essentially we are doing injections to ourselves. I didn't know that ahead of time. So it's just, doing injections and also taking medication multiple ways. I had to take medication 5 different ways, which I didn't know about that either. So
Can we pause there for a second?
Yeah.
Can you tell me what the 5 ways are, if you're comfortable?
Yeah, of course. So there's the injections, and those are, you often mix the medications yourself and then either do the injections yourself, or if you have a partner to do that. I also know some people who they and their partner were not able to do it. So they would either go to their clinic, but that's a couple times a day, every day for, it could be up to, 2 weeks when you're, in this phase. Or I do know of some places that actually, like, there's a nurse who, you can hire and have them come to your house and do it. So there's the injections, there's oral pills. There is, like, for example, I had to put estrogen patches on my stomach at times. And then there are like vaginal suppositories. Yeah.
Wow, that's a lot of, I'm just thinking about the amount of overwhelm that would cause, not just the tracking of what to do, but also the physical sensations of applying medication in so many different ways. It's a lot on a sensitive body, any body, but sensitive body.
Yes, it is. And, for me, I think for my sensitivity, I'm like, my muscles tend to twitch. And so they were twitching even more during stims. I get itchy sometimes. I was even more itchy.
Yes.
I feel bloated sometimes. I felt even more bloated, which, to go back to what I was saying earlier, typically, a woman's ovaries are the size of thumbs. By the end of stims, when you're ready for the egg retrieval, ovaries are the size of tennis balls.
Wow, that's a big change.
Huge. So you are so bloated. And then there's a fear of, so, like, I was doing pole dancing before I started all this.
Yeah.
And I had to stop because there's this fear that, like, something could get twisted or torn internally. So there really is a lot of wear and tear that happens on the body. And then, there's nausea and GI issues and just so much, and bruising from the injections, and it's a lot.
Yeah, everything is disrupted, and you kind of have to halt also how you're taking care of yourself, even.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it really, just thinking about the schedule, like, sometimes I had to take like oral pills 3 times a day and do injections 2 to 3 times a day, and they're different. So you have to be so organized and scheduled. And even me, who is very organized, it's still really overwhelming. And then there's the fear of, oh my gosh, if I mess up, if I forget something, if I accidentally take it twice, or what if I leave the medication out? I mean, these medications are $25,000.
Right. The stakes are so high on every level.
Yeah,
Financially, logistically. I mean, this is your shot to do this.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So that I would say is kind of an overview of the physical impacts. Mentally, I think as an HSP and also someone who is an overthinker and anxious, I was always thinking 3, 5, 10 steps ahead.
Sure. You have to.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
planning for, I mean, I was about to say planning for the best and worst case scenario. I don't even think I was able to plan for the best case scenario.
Mm-hmm.
I think I couldn't allow myself to even think about being pregnant, having a baby, because I was so tunnel vision. I had to just get through this phase.
You're just focusing then on applying the medications, going through the IVF process, but not able to even let yourself think what's next. That
Exactly.
makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And what was really interesting is typically in my relationship, my husband is much more of the, I don't want to say pessimist, I'll say realist.
Realist?
Yes. Where he can kind of jump to a conclusion of like, oh, we're doomed, I'm just
Right,
joking.
right.
But he tends to be, and I'm much more patient and
Mm-hmm.
optimistic and like, okay, hold on, like let's take a step back, let's
Yep.
pause. And our roles kind of switched when we were going through
Mm.
IVF. And that was
Mm-hmm.
really surprising to both of us.
Yeah.
So, for example, I ended up doing 3 retrievals back to back to back. And which was a lot on my body too. I mean, some people
Mm-hmm.
take breaks, take long breaks in between, but I kind of was like, well, we're on this train. Let's just
Right.
keep going.
Yep.
And after my first egg retrieval, I believe 22, I got 22 eggs were, taken. I'm actually going to look up my stats.
Mm-hmm.
So let's see. I had, so the first retrieval, oh, actually 20 eggs were retrieved,
Mm-hmm.
which you find out the day of. So I woke up, I was put under, woke up and they say, hey, you got 20 eggs. So I'm thinking, oh my gosh, that's incredible.
That's a good number.
Yeah, yeah. And
Okay,
the thing
great.
is, well, it's also like kind of the Goldilocks because too many. I mean, some people can have 30, 60 eggs retrieved. And that is, but oftentimes those eggs aren't mature. So actually
Got it. Okay, so it's
that's,
mm,
they can hyper stimulate
got
or
it.
overstimulate, sorry. But then
Mhm.
there's some people that don't get enough and maybe only get 1, 2, or 3 eggs, that
Okay.
are retrieved. So it's like, it's just this numbers game. So like
Yeah.
20 felt like a really good number, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the next day they called me and said, of those 20, 12 of those are mature eggs
Okay.
and 9 were fertilized.
Okay, so it quickly drops down. You're
Yep.
you're less than half now of what you thought you had.
Exactly. And
Wow.
then you have to wait a couple days
Mhm.
until they call it's blastocysts that they say, like, hey, this is how many made it to blast. Out of the 20 eggs, only 2 of my embryos, so that's after the egg and the sperm have been,
Right.
fertilized.
Mm-hmm.
Um, of those 9, 2 of them
Oh,
made it to blast.
wow.
And then we got ours tested each time, which
Mm-hmm.
is
Like genetic testing?
genetic testing.
Uh-huh.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to send the embryos out, and it can take a couple of weeks, and it's not covered by insurance.
Right. A
And
lot
you
of
have
this
to
is out of pocket.
a lot of it, and I'll get into
Yeah.
the financial piece later, but
Sure.
it's a couple $1,000s each time.
Wow.
Yeah. And so of those 2, one of them was a healthy embryo and one was unhealthy.
Wow. So you go from 20 to what an emotional roller coaster.
Such an emotional roller coaster. And I remember the exact moment that we got that call. I was in my bedroom and I was
Mm-hmm.
just devastated because here I am
Yeah.
knowing that I was probably going to do multiple retrievals
Yeah.
because my insurance allowed us to bank embryos, which
Mm.
means you can basically do multiple rounds of retrievals and kind
Mm-hmm.
of store your your embryos,
Oh, great.
whereas other plans sometimes, or a doctor and patient might decide together, we'll
Hmm.
do a retrieval and then we'll do the transfer, the embryo transfer.
So
And then
either
if
you
that
transfer or you bank it?
pretty much, yeah. And then
Okay,
there's fresh transfers and frozen transfers. I
got
mean,
it.
there's
Okay.
so many different
Yeah, very, yep.
variations.
It's
And
a
I'm not
lot. I mean, there's thinking about overthinking. There's so many ways that you could just get
yeah,
frozen in this process.
totally. And it
Wow.
is so, it's like literally learning a new language. It is
Yes.
so complicated
Yeah.
and complex.
Mhm.
So we knew early on we were going to do a couple retrievals. Our insurance allowed 4 a year.
Okay.
And so I kind of went in saying I'm going to do 4.
Hmm.
That's kind of where my mind was. And I just remember getting the phone call that only one of them was healthy and being absolutely devastated.
Hmm.
And of course, thinking like, oh my gosh, like what if we only get 1 or 0 the next time?
Right.
And this
This
is
could
our
be a
only
trend.
exactly,
Yeah.
and my husband and I was just so amazed by him. He said, Liz, this is so good. It means that this is working. I have faith in this process now.
Wow. Oh, what a bright light to come in and help you see that. Like, oh, this is actually, there's still hope.
Yes,
We
because
have one healthy embryo that we
exactly.
can
And I,
work with. Yeah.
yeah. And I was like, we
Mm.
only have one. And he's like, but we have one.
We have one. Right.
Yes. And, it was just, it was really helpful for me to
Yeah.
kind of step out of the pity and
Hmm.
uh, sadness and to be able to say, wow, okay, because we had been given a 1% chance to conceive naturally. So really,
Yes.
if you think about it, it's pretty incredible that we
Yeah,
had
that's
this
true.
embryo.
Yeah, it's a miracle.
Yeah. And I'll just really quickly. So the second retrieval, I had 25 eggs that were retrieved.
Hmm.
And then I don't have to go through all the numbers, but we ended up with 6 uh, embryos that got tested.
And we're viable?
Um, 4 of them were
Okay. Okay.
viable, and then one wasn't, and one we had to get retested anyway. That ended up being an unhealthy one. So
Hmm.
4 out of 6 of those ended up being healthy. Now,
Okay.
let me also say that what really complicated this is
Hmm.
that out of those 5 now embryos that we had that were
Yeah.
healthy, all 5 were girls.
No way.
And I had my heart set on a boy. Yeah,
Okay. Okay. So there's so many layers and potential for disappointment along the way.
exactly.
Wow. Okay.
And we had to decide, are we going to do a third retrieval
Hmm.
before we knew what the results of the second retrieval were
Right.
also? So it was just, it's such a, just this game of waiting and making decisions, and parts of it
Yes.
are so faster than like you have to make a split-second decision, right? And then
Right.
there are parts that are so painfully slow that it feels like time is just stopped.
Yes. This is, I mean, this is high pressure for anyone, but I'm just thinking as an HSP who is
Mhm.
literally wired to process slowly, to think about decisions for a really long time,
Mhm.
who, has to kind of minimize stimulation physically, emotionally, mentally. You're putting yourself through the ringer.
Yes, in every way. That's why I said like I mean physically, but also it's this mental game that you have to
Yes.
play, and emotionally, just
Yes.
the impact of having, I think it was 5 different types of
Hmm.
medications, but or I'm sorry, it was 5 different ways that I took medications, but it
Yeah.
was in total I took 17 different types of medications.
Wow. That's a lot.
A lot. And my doctor, who was fabulous, was
Hmm.
very, I say aggressive with her treatment, meaning that she really pushed, my body to the limit because she knew that I could get more
Right.
ends.
Right. But at some point, does that, yes, you could, but is it at some point but I don't want to, or it's too much, even though physically I can, maybe emotionally I can't.
I think for me, I it was almost like it's either all or nothing.
Yeah, you have to keep going.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
I also know that for a lot of people,
Mm-hmm.
they need a slower pace. They need
Yeah.
a gentler course of treatment. And what's funny is like typically I would be that person who
Mm-hmm.
needs a lot of time because as you were mentioning, like I need a lot of time to process. And
Yeah.
but also maybe there was a fear that if I took a pause, I wouldn't be able to start up again.
Well, that too. It's just thinking about what you already know about this process.
Mhm.
There's going to be such a deep resistance from your nervous system next time, knowing just how intense it is
Yeah.
and depleting it is. So at this point, it's like, well, it's better to keep going.
Yeah. And actually, so there's a there's so many different procedures, but there's something called duo stim, which
Mm.
is essentially doing two egg retrievals in one cycle.
Mm.
So not giving my body time to adjust after that egg retrieval
Right.
and like get my period and then start up again. It's
Yeah.
basically like a couple days after you start the stims again.
Just go
And
right back into it.
yep. And so our
Hmm.
plan after the first retrieval actually was to go right into the
Hmm.
next one and do duostim, but I developed mild OHSS, which is when your ovaries hyper overstimulate.
Mm. Hmm.
And so I did actually have to give my body a little bit of a rest. And when I say a little bit of a rest, the typical amount, like
Right.
a couple extra days, but my body was like, nope, we can't go right into it too much.
Yeah, sometimes your body will tell you the answer.
Exactly.
Throughout this, I mean, we talked about why it could be harder as an HSP, but is there any
Mhm.
parts of being sensitive that actually was helpful during this process?
Well, I think overthinking things and, having a plan A, B, C.
Yeah.
I think some of that was definitely helpful at times. I'm not going to say all the time.
Yep. Hmm.
Probably one of the biggest pieces that was helpful is my need for connection is so deep that I ended up finding really amazing providers
Yeah.
who were trauma informed and
Mhm.
sensitive and who really guided me throughout the process.
Yeah. Seemed like that was a bolster throughout, whether it be with your husband, whether it be with your doctor saying, you can do this. Let's help you see the bigger picture here. Keep to help you keep going. That's so important to have the right people around you. And I mean, at any time in life, but especially when you're going through something so vulnerable and high stakes. That makes sense. So those relational gifts of being sensitive, you pick the right people.
I did. I
And
did.
maybe having good intuition helps too, I wonder, as an HSP. Like
100%.
knowing like this person feels right. I wonder if that came in at all.
Yeah. And knowing when the person didn't feel right also.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And part of the reason that, and we'll get into this at the end, but part of the reason
Yeah.
I created a new business and
Yes.
formed a national directory is because
Yes.
my first doctor,
Mm-hmm.
before the one that I'm talking about, was terribly insensitive
Mm.
and really activated my trauma and was just it was such an upsetting experience that I went through that I tend to, I don't get angry very often, but when there's an injustice and when I'm
Yeah.
personally affected by it, that's when I tend to act.
Yes.
And I actually kind of love that specific type of anger that comes up in me because it's like fire. It just feels
Yes.
like I have to do something about it. And I think
Yes.
my sensitivity really played into that
Yeah.
because it was just this passion, this fire.
Mm-hmm.
And, it ended up getting me to where I am now.
Yeah, it's so empowering and useful
Mhm.
because, we're emotionally impacted, but then we can channel that emotion into action and there's no other choice. Like, I don't want other people to go through what I've went through,
That's exactly what I've said since the beginning. Yeah.
right? And I know, well, I imagine, I don't know for sure, but
Mhm.
that's what helps spark you into saying, I'm going to help other people find the right providers because I don't want them to go through what I just went through.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And truly, I've experienced wonderful, but also harmful providers throughout the
Yeah.
infertility journey,
Mm-hmm.
my pregnancy, during the birth, postpartum.
Yeah.
I've come across providers who have done so much harm, and
Mm-hmm.
it's not okay, first of all, but I
No.
want to empower other women that it's okay to say no. It's okay
Yeah.
to fire a provider for any reason. It's okay to, it's not just okay, but it's essential to have a team of people that you feel safe and comfortable with, because infertility and pregnancy, I think especially, are the most vulnerable times that a person might ever go through in their life.
Mm-hmm.
We
It's
are a
okay.
very vulnerable population.
Absolutely. And it's okay to have standards of who you want to bring into that process with you.
High standards.
High standards. Yes,
Yes.
exactly.
Yep.
I want to talk about parenting, but before we do, I'd love to just pause on this point a little bit. Let's say someone is starting the process of looking for a provider. What would you say is a big red flag to look for in a provider?
Ooh, a red flag. Okay.
Yeah.
I thought you were going to ask, okay, what should they look for? Um, so something that I started doing
Mm-hmm.
is actually doing a couple of consultations and interviews with
Mm,
providers before deciding to work with them.
smart.
And I mean, I will say that it's like, to interview doctors at an infertility clinic, you have to be registered as a new patient. So it
Mm,
is paperwork. I mean, it felt like I was signing my life away, just
sure.
filling out so many forms about my history. I mean, essentially think about
Yeah.
when you going to a new doctor, but this is
Mm-hmm.
like super intense. So I just know that it's probably going to be a process, but I'd
Yeah.
much rather someone go through and meet with the doctor and
Mm-hmm.
decide this isn't right than to like
Mm-hmm.
go through and get, weeks, months in and just and realize, this isn't the right person and then have to
Yeah.
switch anyway.
Right.
Um, so I think, again, okay, I know I went to what should you do, but with that being
But
said,
let's talk about both. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot to learn though during those consultations. Oh, and what I was going to say is a red flag is if the provider doesn't have an answer to the question, like,
Mm.
tell me how you're trauma informed, or tell me how you
Yes.
support patients
Mm-hmm.
emotionally.
Yes.
Because that's something that was, for me personally, very important, was to find a provider who
Yeah.
understood the nuances and the sensitivity of working with someone who was going through infertility and then pregnancy and had a history of sexual trauma. Like, to
Mm-hmm.
me, I needed to have that extra degree of
Yes.
sensitivity.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't think there were too many wrong ways to answer that question until I asked the question.
Yeah.
And the answers were really telling and really disappointing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Ranging from, oh, I don't know, I've never thought about that.
Whoa.
Yep. To the midwife who I ended up choosing, giving just such a beautiful answer, which she gave specific examples of how she asked for consent
Mm-hmm.
and is, wants to know about my history. And then she also said, and I learn from my patients too. And so
Mm-hmm.
I
That's
realized,
it.
yep, exactly. She was collaborative. She wanted
Yes.
to know from me,
Mm-hmm.
also. And that felt so safe. And that was the answer I didn't even know I was looking for, but I was.
That's it. You know when you feel safe.
Yeah.
And you brought up a good point, which is even if you think you know the answer, ask the question anyway, just in case. You said, I don't think that there would be a wrong answer to these questions, but you found out there was. Not everyone's trauma informed, not everyone is collaborative.
Right.
I think we have these assumptions about providers that this is how they should be, but a lot of times they're not. We have to
Yeah.
ask those questions.
And what I found too with medical providers specifically is they can be a fantastic medical doctor,
Yes.
and the bedside manner may not be so great. And I think
Mhm.
that's what can be really challenging, is that conflict, that disconnect, when you get someone who gives you really great medical care
Yeah.
and they can do harm, emotional harm.
Absolutely. They could be a very skilled medical clinician, but then, right, that emotional piece is just as important. If they're not trauma informed, if they're not client or patient oriented, they could, I mean, this is a very vulnerable process as you shared. Um, you need someone who's going to feel safe in that.
Yeah. And
Definitely.
speaking of that first reproductive endocrinologist, the
Hmm.
infertility doctor that we met with, she was TikTok famous. I mean,
Hmm.
she
Yeah.
is like very well known in the
Yep.
field,
Hmm.
and she is, again, great at what she does, but
Yep.
I felt like a number to her
Hmm.
and to the clinic as a whole. And I
Yep.
think that's another piece of, especially going through infertility as an HSP,
Yeah.
is we can read people really well. You know when you're being treated well or not. You know
Yep.
when you're being kind of shuffled around. And
Hmm.
like, not that I expect, the red carpet rolled out for me, but
Oh, yeah.
I expect communication. I expect respect.
Hmm.
And um, it, even the basics weren't there.
Yeah, exactly. It's a good reminder. You know when something's off as an HSP.
Oh yeah,
Trust it. Just because someone has a really strong reputation or has a really successful clinic, it's okay if you choose something that's less shiny,
mm-hmm.
if it works for you and it feels
Yep,
safer and more welcoming. I mean, this is such an important time to be picky if you can be.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a lot at stake, and
A lot at stake.
there's so much trust that you have to put into your doctor, who's really guiding
Hmm.
you
Yeah.
and making a lot of decisions, and using their
Yes.
expertise, because this is all new and
Hmm.
scary. And it yeah, so it's just so important that you find someone who you feel like is really seeing you as a human being and as a person, not just as a number and someone
Right.
to add to their stats of positive
Right.
pregnancy test.
Exactly. And this is personal.
Yeah.
So you've gone through this IVF process, and I'm wondering if we could now talk about what was the transition like moving from that into parenting. And I know not everyone gets to do that,
Mhm.
but I wonder if we could speak to that process.
Yeah. Hard. It was very challenging.
Yeah.
And I think what made it so hard for me is just a couple extenuating circumstances. One is having my birth plan essentially ripped up in a million different pieces
Yep.
and tossed out the window and lit on fire and stomped on. I mean,
Mm.
all the things. My
So
birth,
heartbreaking.
yeah, it was, and it didn't go the way I planned. My plan was to. I mean, I interviewed multiple midwives. I knew I wanted a midwife rather than an OBGYN.
Hmm.
And so I, saw this midwife practice throughout my entire pregnancy.
Mm.
I picked out, there were 3 different birthing suites. I got to go and I chose the middle one. Like, this is, birthing suite number 2. It's this beautiful room with a big tub. Like, I wanted
Hmm.
to do a water birth,
Yeah.
and I had to get transferred to the hospital.
Mm. So all this planning, and I know you're such an organized person, and you probably had this, you get settled into this
Yeah.
version of it, right? Like, this is what I am expecting. And then it just gets thrown out the window.
Yeah,
So hard as
totally.
an HSP. Hard
Yeah,
in general, also hard as an HSP when we need more time for change.
exactly.
Mhm.
And well, time I got, because the labor was 57 hours total. So
Gosh, 57 hours, Liz.
57 hours.
Wow.
I had no idea how high of a pain tolerance I had until I went through that,
Sure.
because 44 of those hours were actually unmedicated
Sure.
until
Wow. So
finally I
almost
agreed to.
2 days you're in
Yeah.
labor with
Yeah.
no medication.
I mean,
Or sorry, nothing to manage the pain.
exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
Minor, I was open to anything
Mm-hmm.
really, except I really didn't want an epidural.
Mm-hmm.
But once I finally agreed to do it, it was the biggest relief. And I was like, why didn't I do this earlier? But no, I know
Oh,
why, but still, like,
yes.
okay, it
Yeah.
wasn't so bad. But I think what was disappointing is it wasn't my choice.
Mm-hmm. That's the
Um,
hardest part, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
So, to have, and then eventually to have, it was never an emergency, but it definitely was an unexpected C-section.
Mm-hmm.
So to have that, to have a really, really insensitive doctor who, something I've also struggled with is with her, she
Yes.
provided fantastic medical care,
Mm-hmm.
and her bedside manner was so, uh, I want to say laughable, but there's nothing funny about it, but it's like
Like you
almost
can't even believe
unbelievable.
it how bad it is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I felt it, my husband felt it, my doula felt it. I mean,
Yeah.
it was pretty awful,
Mm-hmm.
the treatment that we all received. But so yeah, combination of this change in birth plan, C-section
Yeah.
slash traumatic birth, and then developing postpartum depression
Yeah.
made it really hard for me to connect with my son
Mm-hmm.
for a good 3, 4, almost 5 months.
Wow.
And in addition to that, we had some major feeding issues with him
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
where I felt like all I was doing was breastfeeding him, but he
Mm-hmm.
still wasn't gaining his birth weight fast enough.
Right.
And so there's this added layer of our pediatrician basically thinking that we were neglecting our child and not
Mm.
feeding him. And it was to be in such a daze from, I mean, I was on very heavy painkillers after the C-section. I was on barely any sleep. And then to have a physician basically say, I think that you are
Mm.
not feeding your son, and they diagnosed him incorrectly as failure to thrive. It was devastating. I mean, just
Yeah.
the scariest thing. And to feel so unheard, unlistened to. They weren't
Mm-hmm.
like anything that my husband and I were trying to say or explain. It was very much dismissed,
Mm-hmm.
and it was literally like talking to a wall. And we did end up switching providers and letting that
Mm-hmm.
one know why. But that was just another piece of all of it
Sure.
that made it really hard to connect.
Oh my gosh. I mean, you've already gone through IVF, which
Yeah.
I haven't personally experienced, but just having supported clients through that process and friends,
Mm-hmm.
um, it wreaks havoc on your physical and emotional body, as you shared. And now to then go through a long, unexpected labor process. And then on top of that, now you're getting accused of not taking care of your child
Mm-hmm.
when you're working so incredibly hard to do everything you can while you're going through postpartum.
Yep.
And this is so difficult. Like, and I can
Yeah.
just imagine just the feeling of what these doctors are saying to you, like, and not being heard in this. Like, I'm struggling.
Yeah. And what's really interesting, I think, about the first visit at the pediatrician,
Mm-hmm.
where, I mean, this just gives you a sense of where I was mentally.
Mm-hmm.
We brought a diaper bag. All I had in there was the hospital paperwork. I
Mm-hmm.
didn't have any diapers or wipes
Sure.
or anything, even though I knew that it made sense, but also I'm like, oh, we live 5 minutes away. He's
Right.
not going to need a diaper change.
Right.
Well, was I wrong? And you know, the and to be looked at like judgmentally, like, oh, well, you didn't bring diapers. Let me see if we have any. Versus what should have happened
Yeah.
was, oh my gosh, this happens all the time, whether or not it does, or this isn't
Right.
the first time this has happened. Of course, you're exhausted, you're healing. Come on,
Exactly.
I'm going to bring you some diapers. Actually, in fact, I'm going to bring you a couple extra. And, I
Yeah.
think I needed to be nurtured and
Mm-hmm.
normalized. And in that moment, that was just one of many moments where I felt so judged and incompetent. And already I was feeling that myself. I was judging myself and I was feeling like an incompetent parent. But then to
Yeah.
have other people essentially say that to you is
Mm-hmm.
not okay.
And you're so right that in that moment you needed compassion.
Yeah.
I mean, they have a new mom in front of them who, I mean, they should know
Yeah.
what new moms go through. They see it every single day, how much of a struggle that is. I mean, even if you were fully resourced mentally, emotionally, physically, you still might not know to bring a diaper if you're 5 minutes away. Right?
Yeah,
Let's think about this and have a little grace instead of being critical and making you feel worse than you already do.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It just amazes me how many providers don't have that bedside manner when they're in the job of caring for people. And as therapists, it's so unfathomable to me,
Mhm.
but I know that they're kind of in a different space and they're just going through the physical motions of care, but I mean, it causes a lot of harm. I know we both have seen people on the other side of that,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
you've and lived it personally as well.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And one of the hardest parts is my strong intuition has really guided me throughout my
Yeah.
entire life, even before I knew what it was or understood it.
Yeah, right.
And when I was experiencing postpartum depression, I felt like that intuition that I typically had was so off. And I couldn't rely on that, just that part of me, that unexplained part
Hmm.
that says when something feels off or not.
Yeah.
And I talked about it a lot with my therapist, and she just had to keep reminding me, Liz, but you did know. You knew that this wasn't the right doctor. You knew it wasn't failure to thrive. Because fast forward, it was a tongue and a lip tie that my son had.
Oh, see, that's
Yeah,
very different.
so different than
Hmm.
failure to thrive.
Hmm.
And it took, I mean, because in the hospital, when I was there for my recovery, a different pediatrician came in every day and checked on him. So
Hmm.
we had four pediatricians, I think, see him over the days. And then at the practice that we left, there were three different doctors. So we saw
Hmm.
all them. So that's seven doctors. Plus, we ended up seeing two at a new practice that we're at now.
Yeah.
Not a single one even mentioned the possibility of a tongue tie.
And maybe didn't even check.
Didn't check, didn't even consider it. It was
Wow.
all, I mean, the diagnoses we got, again, failure to thrive.
Hmm.
One doctor said he was a lazy eater.
Oh, here we go with the labels.
Yeah.
A lazy eater versus maybe thinking about what are the other options. This makes me so
Yes.
angry.
I know. I know. I get really fired up when I talk about this because and so I had to really fight to get the correct diagnosis, and
Hmm.
ended up meeting with I'd already been seeing a lactation consultant who it just wasn't quite the right fit.
Right.
And so I ended up meeting with a new one who right away was like, I see some red flags for a tongue tie. She said,
Okay.
I want you to meet with a speech therapist. I'm
Hmm.
also going to give you a referral to a pediatric dentist and
Great.
also a doctor who is a pediatrician and a lactation consultant. So
Mm.
she can help you kind of rule out what's going on with, because it might be something on your end, it might be your son's end, or it might be both.
Right.
And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is what I needed. Like a
What relief.
nice, yeah. And we met with all those people, and within a couple weeks, we had the tongue and lip tie procedure, the frenectomy, and
Hmm.
that day, either that day or the next day, my son was actually like able to turn his head while he
Wow.
breastfed, rather
Wow.
than um, you know, like contorting his body and me contort. I mean, just the way that we were both kind of having to move our
Yes.
bodies in this really unnatural position
Hmm.
was like, I think back to him and I'm like, oh, this poor little guy, he was just so tight. His whole
Yes.
body was so tight, and all he
Right.
wanted to do was just like release and be free. And
Yes. And then he was.
then he was. Yes.
Oh, I'm just curious what's happened since that procedure. I mean, it's such a testament to find the right providers, trust your instincts, advocate for yourself. So after that happens, I'm curious what's next.
Yeah. So at that point, when we met with that new lactation consultant,
Hmm.
he was, I believe, the second percentile for weight for his
Mm.
age. So we were, and he'd always been really small for his age, but that, second percentile, pretty, uh, we definitely were, there were some concerns, right?
Hmm.
We wanted to make sure that he was gaining weight. And after the tongue and lip tie release after me being taught how to use the pump,
Oh, sure.
being fitted
Yeah.
correctly, because
Yeah.
all these things too, I didn't have the brain power to figure it, even though I
Yeah.
tried, I couldn't figure this
Mm-mm.
out on my own. So to have the resources and the tools to actually be able to produce enough
Mm-hmm.
milk to figure out how to feed him,
Yeah.
um, we did drop actually at one point below like the percentile chart. So he was not even on it, which
Yeah.
again was very concerning.
Sure.
But we got back up and slowly crept up and crept up and crept up. And at his 9-month appointment, he was in the 44th percentile.
Oh, so amazing.
Yes, the boy loves to eat.
He's making up for lost time.
He is, but he is just like the sweetest, funniest little ball of personality. He is
Mm-hmm.
highly sensitive, also like his
Yes.
mama, and he's
Mm-hmm.
just doing so amazing. We just came
Oh,
back from a trip to Mexico. We flew with him, and he was so great.
oh, I love it.
Yeah, things are really turning around, and being a mom is still very challenging. And there's no
Sure.
doubt about it. It's really hard. I'm still pumping 4 5 times a day
Mm-hmm.
to give him milk, but it's also like it's he was meant to be my, well, I'm trying to think of how I want to say this. Sometimes I look at it and I'm just like, I'm so happy I'm your mom. Like I just am
Oh,
so lucky that I get to be your mom.
yes. Isn't it so beautiful?
Yeah.
And you, I mean, you went through all of this and here he is. What a incredible story
Yeah.
of perseverance and strength and resilience in both of you, really.
Yeah. I mean, he's a
Yeah.
fighter. He was stuck. I mean, part of the reason the birth was so long is because his head was like lodged in a weird place, and he does
Oh,
have kind of a
that's
big
so.
head. So,
Uh-huh.
so
That's sweet.
yeah. But both of us together have really, and
Yeah.
my husband, I'll
Of
include him
course.
in this.
Yes, of course.
I think the three of us make a really great little team,
You
little family.
do. You so do. Well, Liz, if there's any message you could leave sensitive listeners who have maybe are starting or going through their infertility journey or going through IVF, what would you want to say to them?
You're not alone, and it's okay to need extra support. It's okay to release people from your life, whether permanently or temporarily, who aren't able to be emotionally supportive, or supportive in other ways that you might need. And to find people, whether it's personally, having friends, whether it's joining an infertility group led by a therapist, or whether it is finding individual providers who specialize in infertility and really understand the nuances and the language. And it's okay to fire a provider who doesn't fit those high expectations that you have and that you really deserve.
Yeah, that you should have. Yeah, thank you. It's such a good reminder that community is important here now, more than ever,
Yeah.
as you go through this. And I'll be sure to share your resources in the show notes, your website, your social media. Also, you have your maternal trauma support network for both parents and providers, correct?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
it's a national online directory that connects women and birthing people to trauma informed providers who specialize in infertility, pregnancy, postpartum, and early parenthood.
Beautiful. Such an important resource. Well, Liz, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much, April, and your listeners.